Talk to me about what's going on at the border. That one's out of left field.
It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. And the fact that it is simultaneously an undeniable fact. I mean, you could go visit it, right? And you could see it. And it's a mystery. Why would anybody allow this to happen? It violates all sorts of things that we all thought were beyond even needing to be discussed, right? The nation has to control its borders. That's part of... Anyway, you asked what's taking place. You want me just to describe what I saw?
Please.
So my son and I, Zach, went to Panama, and we traveled to the province of Darien, to the edge of the Darien Gap. Actually, we went into the Darien Gap, but we traveled by car to the edge of it. The Darien Gap is it's a section of the Pan American Highway that has never been built. The Pan American Highway runs from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska to the southern tip of South America.
Whoa.
You can drive the whole way except for the 60-mile stretch at the border between Colombia and Panama. What is there is a wilderness. There's a national park. And it is a famously difficult stretch of land to cross. There are currently thousands of people, thousands a day, being beckoned across the Darien Gap, largely by the international community, which is facilitating this massive migration. Some of the people who are migrating are South Americans. There's a lot of people from Venezuela fleeing economic collapse there. But there are a lot of people coming from around the world. They fly into Quito, Ecuador. The reason they fly into Ecuador is that there's no visa requirement, so they can land in Ecuador without a visa. They can move overland into Colombia, and they can cross the Darien Gap into Panama. So what we saw was on the Panama side, we saw what I came to understand as two distinct phenomena. There's one massive migration, lots of South Americans, lots of people from elsewhere in the world, from the Middle East, Yemen, people from Haiti. They are housed in encampments that are built in settlements that exist in Darien already. So people are walking out of the jungle. They are walking into these little towns that exist on the edge of the jungle. These towns have had refugee camps built up by the international community. So the Panamanians aren't happy to have this massive migration moving through their habitat, but they have no control over it.
How's that possible?
Well, the Panamanian border is supposed to be controlled by the Senafront, which is the Panamanian Border Authority.
Is it a separate entity?
Yeah, it's a military police entity that is charged with controlling the frontier.
And they don't answer to the Panamanian government?
No, they do. Oh, they absolutely do.
Okay,
they're a part of the Panamanian government.
Got it. So then Panama could stop this.
Well, see, this is the thing. We, as little people, don't understand international relations. Could Panama technically stop it? Yes, they could technically stop it. But what would happen to Panama if they did presumably explains why they don't. So the Panamanians are not in a position to override whatever it is that wants this migration to happen.
How much of Panama's stance is public, and how much are you inferring?
That is a good question. Let us put it this way. The discussion of the migration is not nearly as substantial as you would expect. And in large measure, what is happening is the migrants are being shunted north as quickly as possible. That from Panama's perspective, the best thing to do is to get these people on their way where they don't become a burden to Panama. And so they are being shuttled through Panama into Costa Rica and through all of the countries up into North America. All of the Central American countries are participating in facilitating this migration for reasons that are not clear. But I said that I come to understand this as two separate phenomena. One of them is this migration of people who, when you talk to them, and we found many migrants were forthcoming about both the trials that they had suffered in the jungle, which are terrifying. Almost all of them had been robbed. Young women were routinely raped. People walk out of the jungle without their children. Children walk out of the jungle without their parents. Oh, it's a humanitarian disaster. Yeah, the Darien Gap is a very difficult piece of habitat to traverse if you know what you're doing. These people do not. They've been induced to try to cross the gap with no understanding of how to equip themselves or what they're actually going to face there. And, it's the kind of habitat where you can slide down a muddy hill and break your leg, and that can kill you because it prevents you from getting out. So it takes accidents and greatly enhances their lethality. But you've got this migration. All of the migrants who will speak to us are economic migrants. They're all very clear about this, which means they're not eligible for political asylum in the U.S., though that is the basis on which they are crossing our southern border. But there is another migration, which is housed separately, which I found very surprising. It is a migration that is almost entirely Chinese, is predominantly young men. Whether the fact that they are of military age is meaningful or not is impossible to say. But what I can say is that unlike all of the other migrants that we encountered, who were surprisingly open about talking about what they were doing and where they were headed and what had motivated them to go, the Chinese migrants, who are housed separately by the Panamanians, they're housed in places that are not towns. Interestingly, they're housed, there's a camp called San Vicente, which Secretary Mayorkas visited when he was in Panama, right before it was expanded greatly. But the Chinese who are moving through the San Vicente camp are unwilling to talk. They give off a hostile air, and it's not clear to me why this should be the case. If they were, for example, fleeing oppression at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, you would expect them to be at least curious about citizens of this country that they were apparently going to start a new life in. That would be a natural thing. And even if they were afraid to talk because they were afraid of what might happen if word got back, you would not get a hostile sense. You would get a sense that they were conflicted or trapped and couldn't talk. But that was not at all the impression they left. The impression they left was one of hostility and mockery, and it was decidedly disturbing. So I began to think of this as an invasion moving in parallel and being cloaked by a migration. The migration is real. The migration is alarming in its own right. It is a humanitarian disaster at the level of what is happening to the people doing the migrating, and it is very definitely being encouraged and facilitated by the international community, which appears to have the idea that migration is inherently a good thing. Now, I don't know how anyone could possibly be that confused, but this is visible if you look at the web pages of the organizations that are doing the facilitating. They say this, that it is their mission to induce migration. They believe that migration is positive. But that migration is cloaking something else. I can't say exactly what that something else is, but it would be irresponsible not to consider the possibility that it is an international competitor taking advantage of our open border to arrange some kind of harm that will be more easily orchestrated that way than it would be on a battlefield.
Okay. I know you tell your kids that when they have a hypothesis, they need to assign a percentage likelihood that it's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage likelihood of accuracy do you give the invasion hypothesis?
So let's be clear on what that hypothesis is. If that hypothesis is that the Chinese Communist Party is sending people across our southern border with the intent to do harm to the United States, I would say 60%.
Whoa. Okay.
Now, there are lots of other possibilities. Does spying fall under that hypothesis? No, I don't think that is specifically to do harm. So
you think it's more than spying. So there's the 60% is like proper harm.
Here's the thing. I know how crazy that sounds. And
Well, my final question will be around that. So one of the early questions I asked you was, is there ever a hypothesis that's so far out that it's better not to even float it out? We've already had that conversation. What I want to understand, though, with this is what happened that gave you that much confidence? Because I agree with you that this is on the table as one of the things that it very well could be. And I don't think you just said this, but I've heard you say this before, which is really powerful. If you believe that there is some element of financial corruption in our system, which I think everybody agrees there's a lot of money in our system, whether we call it corruption or not is almost a moot point, that there's a ton of money in our politics, money moves the needle here. If people know that from the outside, would they not leverage that to get what they want? So that could be paying a ton of money to ensure that the migrants are allowed in the country. But what I want to know is, this is such a high degree of certainty from somebody I consider so cautious in their thinking. But this falls into that bucket that you're playing with more and more as you got battered through the COVID situation. It felt to me like you got, I don't know if frustrated or angry, but you started making bolder claims. And this one is the one, help me understand, what are the building blocks that make it up? So we know they had their own migration going in. They didn't act in the way that you expected them to act. They were hostile.
Well, first of all, let me say, this is part of why I decided I had to go in person.
Because had you already been hearing this before?
You went? Yeah. The folks who showed Zach and me this migration had been sending materials for better part of a year. So I was quite aware of what I was likely to see, but it made no sense. And frankly, I talked almost not at all about it because I did not want to find myself broadcasting things that turned out not to be what had been represented to me. I was very cautious about it. And it was hard to justify going. It's not an especially safe place to go. What was I going to see that I couldn't deduce from a video? But I was very glad that I did go, because the physical relationship between these two different migrations, and most importantly, the approach that the migrants in the Chinese camp had to us was unmistakable. It was hostile. Now, why was it hostile? It's hard to... So part of the reason that you find that number as high as you find it is that, given what I saw, it is hard to come up with other explanations for it. Right? Were these people fleeing oppression? That was inconsistent with the way they dealt with us. It did not feel right. Now, can I convey that to you in a way that you would have a degree of certainty about it? Not really. I don't think you know me well enough to know what it would take to trigger that circuit for me. But here's the other question. We have a southern border that is effectively open.
Yep.
We are not doing even the most basic due diligence with respect to establishing who is crossing that border, and why? Given that, do you believe that our antagonists abroad will take advantage of that fact? I find that almost certain.
Yes. So I find the hypothesis compelling, but I thought you were going to say like 7 to 10%. So let me lay out the part where you and I agree. And then as the person that's just armchair quarterbacking it, I'll give you sort of my take, knowing I haven't been there. And so I really am just pulling the shit out of my ass. But so I have heard from enough analysts of China that the Chinese diaspora is a very meaningful thing. And that some percentage of the people in the Chinese diaspora really view themselves still as Chinese, regardless of where they live. Now, this is just analysts that I've heard speak. This is not me forming a firsthand account. So I know that this is part of my distortion on my lenses. This is not, I don't trust this, but in terms of hypothesis, being very unsure, but it's an interesting guess that warrants exploration. So to your point, governments are going to do what they can to get a leg up. We are in a pure competitor relationship with China. China has every reason to want to know more about what we're doing, as we have every reason to want to know what China's doing. Now, breaking from that, I will say it is very possible that China is in a pretty rough economic situation right now. If the housing issue there is as big as some pundits are making it out to be, again, no firsthand knowledge, don't know, but certainly interesting. I could see not being of that culture, missing cues, misreading cues so that they seem hostile or whatever. Again, they could be throwing things at you, spitting, I don't know, but that'd be pretty tough to misread. But if it were more of just a body language, refusal to interact, scowling, that kind of thing, then...
Well beyond that.
Okay. Give me the craziest thing they did.
Well, I don't know that any of it was crazy, but we attempted to interact with several different groups at the San Vicente camp. One gentleman attempted to mislead us into believing that he was Korean, and Michael Yan, who took us to Darien, who has spent time in China, tripped him up and revealed that this was a deception, at which point there was laughter amongst the group who had witnessed this attempted deception. And then, following that, there was no willingness to talk about the reality. It wasn't that this had been a practical joke on, some naive foreigners and that broke the ice, right? This was a deception that was exposed, and it led nowhere. I also believe that we were monitored in the camp. So there was a particular guy I was watching who repositioned himself as we moved to different places in order to witness what was taking place there, and I believe he was keeping tabs on us. I don't know why that would be. Didn't strike me as a normal behavior for somebody who is, involved in a major migration to a new homeland.
It still feels qualitative, though.
Yep.
So we have qualitative feedback, because so you don't know this about me, but my background is actually writing. So I often ask myself, if this were a character and I were writing them, what would have to be true for them to act this way? One could be, I'm here as a spy, for sure, or I'm here to do harm. But honestly, if I'm coming to fuck you up, the last thing I'm going to do is be openly antagonistic. I'm going to be super friendly, because I do not want you to be cued into what I'm really doing. But if I have a dim view of Americans, and I've got some sense of, I'm going to America because I want to bring my culture to another great place, and I want to spread the Chinese diaspora, and I have no idea what inside of China they say about America. They could say lovely things. I have no idea. But I know that across Europe, it hasn't been I came to England because I want to embrace English values. It is, in many cases, I've come to England and I plan to stake my values, and I'm trying to bring as many people over as I can so that we can really have our own, at least pockets where our culture is the culture. And given that America hopefully still has that vibe of we want diaspora people. We want people to come here and make this a cooler place. Now, I think that we have to reckon with that, because I don't think you can bring this many people over at once. I think we're going to have problems. But like, I still like the vibe of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, weak, huddled masses. Like, I fucking love that vibe. Anyway, I can write a bunch of backstories for these guys where, yes, they're clowning on the idiot Americans, even though they're trying to get to America. Now, whether they're fleeing China, because China, with my archetype, is not the kind of place I would want to be, or they're coming over as an invasion, I don't know. The only thing I would say is I can paint a lot of scenarios where they are probably still problematic from a whole host of very non-sinister, non-spy-y reasons. But it could also be exactly what you're saying. I just would have, again, I have not been there, so I've not seen the things that you see. So I'm in the DMT position again of I haven't met the little guy. But it feels to me with qualitative data that it warrants a more cautious percentage.
Well, the question is, what would you think if you had been there?
I don't know.
And
I might be way more hardcore than you. I might be 90%. Don't know.
Nobody has any trouble accepting that China's building weaponry. And so the point is, it's not beyond our thought process to imagine that somebody might be preparing for war with us. But for some reason, this bargain, hey, their southern border is open. Can we do anything with that? Is it worth sending in, maybe the decision to utilize them hasn't been made, but the idea is it would be a shame not to take advantage of that open border while it's still open, and who knows how long it will be.
Do you have an estimate of how many Chinese have crossed?
I believe it's tens of thousands.
Whoa.
It's a lot.
Okay. For a second, let's just pretend that the dark scenario is the true scenario, which you've 60%, I'm like 7%, but whatever. Do you think that we're going to have a reckoning? Like if you send tens of thousands of people that still have allegiance to the homeland and the homeland wants to do you dirty, I don't even like thinking like this. This is interesting. This is triggering some World War II vibes in me. Which I'm not loving, but let's finish the thought experiment. I get your friend hates that, but do you think we have a reckoning coming with a potential problem where the call came from inside the house?
I don't understand why this is even tough.
Because it seems self-evident that an enemy would want to do this.
Given a manifestly open southern border, you don't think anybody's going to notice that they can send people over it and utilize? I mean, how many years did we spend taking off our shoes in airports? Right. I mean, and the absurdity of, if you come across the border, if you come home from Central America, you will be monitored. They will know exactly who's crossing the border at exactly what moment you're doing it, right? It's a whole different situation. You will have scrutiny exerted in your case. And in another case, there's no scrutiny. That is a mystery to me. How did that happen? When I ask obvious questions, like, we have a corrupt political system. It's pay for play. What is to have stopped our antagonists abroad from having purchased influence with which to get us to harm ourselves? Isn't that the obvious bargain?
If they can do it well, in a way where I don't realize that's what the money's for. I think it's something good. Yeah, I could for sure. Right. I see a lot of really bad ideas get a lot of energy. So, not saying I think this has happened, but it certainly fits the incentive model.
I think that the thing that I don't understand is that we apparently spend, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars on the intelligence community to think way outside of the box and figure out how a very clever enemy could possibly get inside our system and compromise us. And we've left the most obvious mechanisms wide open. And to talk about what my assessment is that the most obvious loopholes are being utilized, is like, well, do you have the evidence for that? The evidence that we have antagonists abroad and that we have people who never sleep because they're concerned that those enemies might get the jump on us, that evidence exists. I don't know what the reason is that the southern border is as open as it is. I don't know why the international community is encouraging migrants into the Darien. I don't know why the Chinese are housed separately. I don't know why the Chinese appear to be facilitated in their migration by their government. Oh, but there's one other thing I wanted to mention to you. And again, this goes back quite a number of years. In fact, goes back enough years that I had in fact forgotten it, and it did not come back up as I was looking at this Chinese migration phenomenon in Darien. When the Chinese one-child policy was in full force, I wrote an essay. I was not a public figure. I don't know that anybody read the essay, but I wrote an essay about a paradox. There is a principle in evolutionary biology that goes back to Ronald Fisher. Ronald Fisher realized something important about sex ratios. He wasn't thinking about humans. And what he realized was that although males and females differ tremendously in how many offspring they can produce in a lifetime, that on average, given some very basic assumptions, on average, they produce the same number of offspring, and there is therefore no advantage to producing males over females or vice versa. That is to say, a male might produce 1,000 times as many offspring as a female in a given case, but on average they produce the same number. So if there are too many males, you should produce females, and if there are too many females, you should produce males, because you tend to succeed better evolutionarily if you produce the rare sex. Now that logic should apply to people, and it should have applied to China. If you were a Chinese person and you were going to only be able to have one child, and they were going to grow up in a nation with an abundance of males, you should want to produce a female. A male might well not find a mate. A female would not only be all but certain to find a mate, but she would have her choice, because females would be in high demand. So why, I wondered all of these years ago, did that not cause the embrace of the production of females? Why did the Chinese continue to produce excess males? And what I came up with was the sobering realization that there was another evolutionary force that might well be in play, which is that in a world of lineage versus lineage competition, that there might be a reason to produce a generation with excess males if you were preparing for war. That excess males actually are the perfect substrate for lineage against lineage violence, because men who have no reproductive prospects at home, who are sexually frustrated, can be armed and sent abroad with a desire to come back a hero, and that would be a very effective mechanism for picking up territory. The same process I described to you when we were talking about genocide. That if you wanted
Doesn't that seem, though, like it would be it's the thing you do when you find yourself with surplus males. It isn't the thing you set out to do.
Well, I agree with you that it would be a natural if you happen to end up with surplus males, but I don't see any reason that you wouldn't have an evolutionary tendency to, especially in a culture that is as far-sighted as the Chinese have been.
It's interesting. I will say that there might be other hypotheses that don't require them to be so calculated, which seems tough to get your whole culture. Like, all you're doing is applying the pressure. You can only have one child, and the nation builds an army for you. Strikes me as, well, not impossible, strikes me as very unlikely. I also have a base assumption that could be wrong, but it's a base assumption in my operating system that China's not very imperialist. So I think that people will confuse their desire to get Taiwan back with and we want to go get more. Like they're pretty like, let the world do what the world's going to do. Like, yes, we want to be financially invested so that everybody owes us one, but we don't want to take them over. We don't want to run their countries. But they want Taiwan back because that's part of the original vision. So anyway, if you've got a nation that is not imperial in nature, and they were literally worried about people starving to death, which is why they said, you can only have one kid. And so then you'll get a brief burst of, we want a male because that's how you pass the lineage on. That's how you pass the cash on. Like, just give me a boy. That's all I want. I have a feeling that if it had kept going on, they would have gone, oh, that was a really dumb strategy. Now I want to have girls because this balance is all out of whack. But because they end up nipping that in the bud, I think in the 90s, so it only runs for like 20 years. So you really only have like one generation to be like, oh, terrible idea. Now, so if it had gone on longer and they kept like making sure that they were only having guys, then I might be a little bit more like, okay, maybe. But
yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, the problem is that the current governance of China is a departure from the historical.
True.
So anyway, I find it interesting that you have a violation of a known evolutionary principle, the balancing of sex ratios. It seems to me that this would have been obvious to an individual, that even if the society viewed male children in a particular way, that you could calculate that for your own lineage, the chances of your child finding a mate suggested that actually it would be clever to have girls. So I don't know. To me, it's an open question, and the fact that we have what looks like an invasion from what looks like one of our principal, I don't like the term enemy, but looks like
competitor,
antagonists abroad.
Well, one thing that could be interesting, again, hypothesis that I have no real reason to believe is actually happening, but is worthy of exploration, would be that this is more of a Viking model where, I find myself with excess males, intentionally or otherwise, and my primary rival has an open southern border, and the Chinese diaspora is real, so I know they will still feel a pretty strong allegiance to the homeland. Let me send them over, which probably isn't a hateful idea. Oh man, I can't remember. There was a guy that was made a spy, and he from Russia. He was actually East German, but anyway, gets recruited to be a spy in the West. And he was like, the thought of like living in America, he's like, they didn't have to convince me. I was totally here for it. So I could see them being like, no authoritarian rule, no social credit score. I'm here for it. Let's go.
Well, I will say the scenario you laid out does fit. If the scenario you laid out was right, then my 60% estimate includes it, right? An opportunistic invasion. That does fit. Sure. But I also wanted to point out that the Chinese, as much as they have a multi-millennium history of effectively being insular, is engaged in what is called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an expansive plan that looks, like a modern imperial.
You think that looks imperial? I think it looks like I want you to owe me one. I don't want to be imperial. I do not want to have to rule over you guys because that shit is messy. But boy, oh boy, do I want to control your infrastructure? Do I want you to have relationships with me? Trade deals?
Want to control the flow of resources and labor to facilitate a Sino-centric future. I'm not faulting
all the good without
the Chinese
having to govern you.
Right. I'm not faulting the Chinese for advocating for their own well-being. I do view, much as I view our government as not synonymous with our population, I see our government as in large measure hostile to the well-being of the citizens, and I feel the same way about the relationship of the Chinese government to the Chinese people. But nonetheless, if there's any, I don't fault the Chinese for viewing the world in competitive terms. That's the adult way to recognize how things work. But I do think we are being naive, not at least publicly entertaining the possibility that our antagonists abroad would take advantage of our lack of security our famous lack of security on our southern border and the international community's facilitation of massive migration would be the perfect cover for something that was not collaborative.
All right. I have a nasty question I want to ask about the 2024 election. Many people think Trump is the rational monster. Is he?
I don't think so. I don't want him to be president because I don't think he has the time, the temperament, or the team building skills to do the job that is necessary. But I do believe he is at least a departure from the ruling cabal, which is clearly hostile to the well-being of average people. That said, I believe there is only one rational choice left to us in this election, and it is Bobby Kennedy Jr.
You don't think that'll split the vote?
I don't even know what to think about that question. The Democratic Party appears to be fielding a candidate who was too mentally decrepit 4 years ago to be elected to the presidency. Running him again is so preposterous that it's not obvious to me how any American can, in good conscience, vote for Biden. It is inconsistent with our constitutional republic that we have a decrepit figurehead who is standing in for a cabal whose names we don't know. People who are unelected, cannot be called in front of Congress and questioned. If we are attacked in the night, who takes the phone call and decides whether we launch the nukes? You cannot have a person as far gone as Joe Biden in that office. That is a different country. So my feeling is the Democratic Party has an obligation to field a reasonable candidate before there is any vote to split. In the absence of that, every single rational American should be fleeing the Democratic Party in favor of whatever makes the most sense. And again, in my opinion, there's really only one plausible candidate for the job running for the office. How the one plausible candidate running for the office is a long shot, I have not figured out. But here you have a guy who has an encyclopedic knowledge of what has just happened to us over the course of the COVID crisis. He's the one guy who's in a position to sort out the implications of what took place so that we can get a proper reckoning and make sure that doesn't happen again. What's more, you have a guy who has a deep understanding of the deep state and is obviously willing to risk his life over the question of how to disengage it from governance so that we can go back to being a democratic republic. I personally know him. I like him a great deal. I trust him. And I believe that his legal knowledge and his wisdom, the fact that this is somebody, his personal familial story is tied up in the exact trauma that our nation has lived under since 1963, right? To have the possibility of putting him in that office to finally move us past that chapter into some renewed phase of American strength to restore the consent of the governed seems to me like the obvious thing to do. We are lucky that we have that option on the table. And I can't believe that we would, in the face of that, be embracing tired tropes like spoiler and the lesser of two evils. Right? Those tropes make no sense in an era where the DNC is fielding Joe Biden in his state of disrepair. It's inconsistent with it. This is an emergency, and we have somebody that we can vote for who makes perfect sense, could inhabit the office, has the skills, has the temperament, would likely have 8 years in which to get the job done. All of those things are powerful arguments in favor of this person, and I really hope people will rethink their reflexive embrace of what amounts to a jersey color over reason.
I've been apolitical my entire life. The system has worked well for me, so I've never had a problem. I've just always been like, I'm going to outwork everybody. I don't give a fuck what you try to do to slow me down. Like, I'm going to keep going. And because it has worked well for me, I don't immediately find myself gravitating towards the problems. Now, Andrew Yang comes onto the scene. And I remember telling my employees the night before the Trump election, guys, he cannot get elected. Like, he is on tape. He said, I grabbed them in the pussy. It's done. Like, I was literally laughing. I'm like, you guys are panicking. He is fundamentally unelectable. It can't happen. And so I was like, go to bed, rest, everything's going to be fine. And so the next morning when I say that, I was like, what? I was so caught off guard and taken by surprise. I mean, it was just, anyway, a very surprising moment. So that was the first time where I thought, whoa, man, maybe votes really do count. Like, that I should have voted. I didn't vote, never even really thought. I'm like, I live in California. It's like, it's a default, state. It's going to go blue. So never thought about the need to vote. Never even took inventory of, am I conservative or am I liberal? None of it, just didn't think about it. As this all starts happening and the Trump thing is kicking off, and I start with just default assumptions that he's a psychopath and he is like literally ruining this country. And then Yang comes around, because I'm like, who am I going to vote for in the next election? Because now I realize I really do need to vote. And Yang came along and I'm like, yo, this dude. And I was really into him. And obviously he gets sort of railroaded off. But then I had him on my podcast. And I was way opposed to UBI. And when I had him on the podcast, I'm talking to him and I'm like, man, I'm still not sure if I agree with UBI or not. But like, I really believe in this dude. Like, and if this dude has looked at this problem that closely and is like, yo, we really have to take this into consideration, I'm just willing to say either I need to go figure it out for myself and do all the hardcore research, or I need to find a proxy that I can trust. And I felt so good about him. So when you came out with Unity, and off camera, I told him, dude, you better fucking run again next cycle, because one, you look super prescient now, because this was right after COVID hit. And I just really think people are going to get used to your way, and there could be a real shot for you. And so when you started talking Unity 2020 and the people that you were putting forth, that he happened to be one, I was like, he gave me the clear sense of what you meant by a patriot. And okay, so that's the framework with which I'm now stepping into the first time I hear about Unity 2020, and I think, ooh, this is interesting. But my first problem is TikTok, man. We are running up against it. So how are you not worried about, and forget it, I know you're going to pull the plug if we can't, but I'm just saying I really want it to happen. So how do we get enough done in the really small amount of time that we have? Like, can you even get on the ballot everywhere?
Well, see, that's the thing. Everybody asks this question. You have to realize something. You probably hadn't heard a plan like Unity 2020 before. In other words, you've probably heard the lesser evil thing a dozen times, right? You've heard why you can't engage in this. And then the answer is, there's actually a very simple solution to that puzzle. Ballot access has this element. If you think, well, ballot access is a matter of collecting signatures, there's a date in every state, and that's it, then we're cooked. That's true. We are cooked. You can't do it that way. It's not the only way. So the question is there something that you are not seeing? And I can promise you there is. Can I promise you that we're going to get there? Oh, I absolutely can't. What we need is a groundswell in order to find out, right? Everything depends on people realizing what I think, even in what you just said, I think is missing, which is I don't think there's any guarantee that something recognizable makes it to 2024 for Andrew Yang to run again. I think Andrew Yang is thinking that it does, right? In fact, I saw an interview in which he ominously said that he had signed something that said he was going to step out of the race this time and not do anything that might interfere with it. Who is asking him to sign what? This is a democracy. Who knows what the future holds? Why would any honorable person ask somebody who is clearly capable, qualified for the job? Why would you take anybody off the map with their signature? Shouldn't a handshake do it and say, look, under foreseeable circumstances, I'm not planning to run? Shouldn't that be good enough for just about anybody? So anyway, something ominous is afoot in our system that wishes to take Andrew out of circulation. We saw it act during the primaries, right? We saw all sorts of shenanigans played in order to limit his influence. I think it's very clear why. You know, again, the Democratic Party does not want to represent the public because it has other priorities. Andrew Yang would clearly represent the public, so he's a non-starter. Frankly, I think he'll be a non-starter in 2024, 2028, you know, whatever it is, right? The problem
within the
is
current system.
Well, let's put it this way. Why is he behaving like a good soldier in the current system if the current system cannot allow Andrew Yang to be Andrew Yang? I mean, there's something just seriously off. So in any case, the thing about Andrew Yang that I really like, and the reason that I named him as a member, the left-leaning member of the prototypical ticket, is that he is very insightful. He's clearly motivated by the right things. To be honest with you, I'm not sure I believe in UBI as presented, but my sense is it's a problem that needs to be addressed. UBI is a proposal. It proves that Andrew is interested in the right things. He's focused in the right place. Personally, I would argue that something like participation income might be a better instantiation. But here's the thing I know for sure. Let's say that Andrew Yang found himself in the White House. There's no problem saying, look, UBI was a cool idea. Here's why it doesn't work. Here's an idea that fixes the problem with UBI and addresses the same thing that it addresses. Andrew Yang would look at it, and if he thought, actually, that does work better, there's no obstacle to it. Right? He would accept it. Or if he understood something about participation income that wasn't as effective at UBI, he'd throw back that argument and we'd find out, right? There's nothing in the system. There's no reason he'd be committed to it. There's no constituency that is favoring UBI that is actually driving his claim to believe in it. So again, it's just a simple matter of let's let democracy work by taking people who can afford to listen to any idea, who don't have a dog in the fight personally, who can actually speak on our behalf. So, yeah, Andrew's perfect for that because he's smart, he's open-minded, he's a patriot. I mean, hell yeah.
So as we, there's some way that you guys see that we can get on the ballot in time. When do you plan to announce who the candidates are, and what is that process of selecting those candidates something that you pass off, or do you have to have the unity party that, you know, has their own sort of version of the DNC that does this? Like what? Because I will say I'm the guy that you probably are aiming at convincing, right? Like I'm ready to be convinced. But right now I feel like if I wasn't obsessed with you as a thinker, I just wouldn't pay attention because I don't have enough details.
Yep.
So it's like, and if I'm saying that like, there's just not enough details here, so I'm just not even going to think about it because I go to a pessimistic place. If they're never even going to be able to get on the ballot, it's just too fucking late. And that there is hopelessness in that. But I think that level of sort of just unquestioned hopelessness, right? I'm only processing through this because I'm sitting in front of you now, right? So
Yep.
Otherwise I wouldn't, it just would be sort of background, like, oh, that'd be cool, but you know, it's just not going to happen in time.
Okay.
How do we give the you know, the optimism and the sense of like, shit, this could really happen?
Okay. So there are a couple answers to the question. One, I don't think there's any point in actually attempting to deliver a ticket if we don't have the groundswell that makes it plausible. Because for one thing, what it does is it actually damages the people who we would name, right?
Interesting.
We want them empowered. In order to empower them to work on our behalf, they have to be drafted into this movement, which requires the groundswell. If we don't get the groundswell, then it doesn't make sense to do it. However, here's the thing that I think you're looking for. Let's say that this plan fails and we're not on track by, well, we can't actually say when because we don't know how the ballots are going to be delivered and therefore when voting is actually going to take place. But let's say we're not on track in time. But let's say that we have managed to accumulate a movement of people that understands that we are now rolling the dice with all of the most dangerous processes on Earth, right? The world superpower is now gambling with the possibility of civil war, right? We haven't even begun to talk about what happens if we fragment. Not only is there no geographical solution that suggests itself in this case, but somehow we're talking about not only a nuclear arsenal, but we're talking about nuclear reactors that need to be carefully managed. How is a transition to some other structure in which the United States ceases to exist going to work? So all I'm saying is the magnitude of the danger that we are putting the world in, even before you get to the question of what happens next if the United States fails because we tear ourselves apart. That empowers China. Is China the next, pole of the world, single pole? Is it going to be Russia? What happens in the absence of a powerful United States? We're putting the world in jeopardy here. So we're putting the world in jeopardy. The process seems to be moving incredibly rapidly, such that we can have a discussion about whether or not there's going to be something to salvage in 2024 or not. This is an amazing level of danger that we are putting ourselves and the world in. In light of that, it seems to me that it makes sense for every person with ears to hear that predicament to gather around, well, what is the chance that we can row to shore? Why wouldn't you take a shot at something like Unity 2020? And here's the thing. If it fails to elect a ticket to the White House, it could still cause all of the projects that aim for a better world to collect into one. We've got the open source movement. We've got the cryptocurrency movement. We've got makers. We've got Game B, right? All of these things. We've got IDW. All of these things aim to solve problems in the legacy world. Why wouldn't they join together and understand that, in effect, the entire game is, can we bring the things that we've learned in all of these different contexts into a structure that has the power to implement them or to clear the obstacles? So, in essence, the answer to your question is whether we succeed or fail in 2020, we can succeed in creating the best hope for the future. Will it be enough? Nobody can guarantee that. I certainly won't. But is it the best hope we've got? I haven't heard a better one. So, what's holding us back from just simply getting behind this idea? It doesn't carry any ideological content that would cause anybody to look at it and say, oh, that's not me, right? It has deliberately been pruned of ideological content so that it can cause these other things to gravitate to each other. And isn't that the movement that we're looking for? One that understands the value of crypto and open source and all of these other things?
I think the real answer to the question of what's holding us back is you don't have sex appeal yet. So like what is going to be the hook? You know what I mean? So and I have not thought through this well enough to know if what I'm about to say is actually true or not. I feel very confident about what I just said. You lack a hook that's sexy enough to get people excited. Yep. But there's so much noise right now. I can't tell you how much my YouTube viewing habits have changed in the last 3 months. It is so surreal to me even to think like now I'm just sort of almost like I'm watching news, right? I'm looking for things that came out right now that are super contextual to what's happening in this moment. There's a cacophony of voices. And because I was apolitical and didn't watch news, I didn't even realize that news had become kabuki theater. And it's so weird to see, like, if I see this same thing being covered on CNN versus Fox, it actually looks like different things happened. I mean, it's so fucking bizarre. And not having an allegiance in either direction, I'm just like, this is fundamentally problematic. Like, if you follow this out to its natural conclusion, you're just more and more and more polarized because there's this weird friction. In fact, I know I'm going afield of where I was originally headed, but this is actually interesting. So there's a weird friction as you adopt one narrative or the other of the same factual thing that happened, but one narrative feels right to you. It feels like you're now cheering for your team. Yes, they're covering it in a way that speaks to me. There's friction in the other one because neither are true. So the other one isn't, oh, I'm getting to truth. It's you're asking me to actually adopt the opposing team's narrative, which already didn't resonate with me on a subconscious level anyway. So now that I'm consciously looking at it, it really feels anathema to who I am. This does not feel good. I don't like this. So it is far easier to go from one interpretation to another if both had a sincere effort to get to the facts and one just missed something, or, you know, that it wasn't said as well as it could be. And so you could gravitate to, oh, I see, this is actually what happened. Cool, I can make that leap. But when the sense-making apparatus is intentionally now so deep into the world of narrative, I can't cross that divide. And so that's what scares me, is there's already people seek things that confirm the confirmation bias, confirm what they already believe. But that's a lot less problematic when the disconfirming evidence doesn't trigger some weird destruction of your identity in the way that now it forces you to, because you have polarized narratives. And how we get past that and have sex appeal is where, like, this starts to worry me. So you cannot let me end this interview without us talking about shutdown STEM, which to me, when I look around and I go, okay, people with guns and riots and stuff, okay, that's all troubling. But the one that scares the shit out of me is shutdown STEM. And we can get into why. But once people detach themselves from what works, what moves you towards your goal, then you can no longer in any effective way move forward. And that's what worries me. So when I think about what the effective way forward here is in this moment with Unity 2020, you have to capture the imagination of people, and you're competing against a narrative that gets people feeling like there is a dragon to be slayed and they're willing to run out in the streets. It's intoxicating. And even if, like, dude, I know you know Mao's China, the revolution, the Red Guard that rose up, and you had students actually killing teachers. And dude, when I stop and think about what I was like in high school, and this really bothers me. I remember when Jordan Peterson said, when you look back on World War II, don't imagine yourself hiding, a Jewish person in your attic. Think of yourself as an SS guard. And I thought, oh God. But when I think about me being 16 during the uprising of the Red Guard, I'd have put dunce caps on my teachers and, hit them with a stick. I would have, dude. Because I felt so right about everything at that age.
Well, I get that. I have to say, I think Jordan Peterson is right. Although personally, I feel a certain amount of security that I wouldn't have ended up an SS guard. No, that not because I'm Jewish. Let's put me in an I don't know, Aryan skin or something. Somehow there's something about me that is so incompatible with a certain kind of authority that it's impossible.
Your movements
imagine.
with Evergreen make that hard to argue.
Yeah. Well, anyway, let's go back to the question of sex appeal for one. Here's the thing. There's a saying that I'm very fond of. It's a Hopi saying. We are the ones we've been waiting for, right? And I think it's just impossibly deep, actually. And so here's the thing. You're a guy who's trying to build a new Disney, right? You're the sex appeal guy, right? You know we're in danger. That's part of why we're having this conversation. So the question is, what is the answer to that? I know full well that you're right, that at some level, what I have deployed reaches a certain number of people who were ready, but it doesn't reach a large enough group. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with the idea. I'm sure of that. But you're right. The question is, can you deliver it narratively in a way that people get it instantly? They understand what it is, why they have to be part of it. And it seems to me that this is the same question we were dealing with earlier, the dynamic tension that really is where all magic comes from, right? You need an idea that'll work, and you need somebody who understands narrative and sex appeal and all of that so that it can live. And how do we do it?
Yeah, as a sex appeal guy, I will tell you, you're never going to get it off the ground without real people, because you're asking me to get excited about a faceless idea. And we're seeing now with some of the movements going on that are creating madness, you can do it. And I think over a long enough time period, you could get people behind this idea. But if you think about the current wave of madness, which I don't even know what name to assign it, but it started in the 60s, 70s. I mean, this has been going now for 40 or 50 years, and it was a long game strategy, and it's worked really well. But you talk about, and this is so important and so powerful, so when I public speak, my message is almost always revolves around humans are the ultimate adaptation machine. And the way that you say that is we've offloaded a lot of our abilities not to genetics, but to culture. And by putting it in the software layer, we're able to change very rapidly. So if I had a gun to my head and you said, dude, you know the mechanisms that are at work here, what do? I say, I need people. And I need people with personality. I need people with charisma. When Barack Obama came along, ignore the effect of the policies. When he got elected, man, it was fucking electric. And I was over the moon. I loved the slogan, the whole notion of hope, having a person, I mean, we're still shouting distance from the civil rights movement. And in what was it, 42 years later, you have a black president. I mean, I was like, fuck yes, man. Like, that was so thrilling to me. And when Coleman Hughes and I were talking not too long ago, I asked him, like, who do you think could have led us? What president would you want leading us through this moment? Now, he's someone who's been very critical of Obama, and he said Obama. And I was like, fuck, you might be right. Because, in this weird world where moral authority is like, you almost just have to take that off the table. And he's such a powerful orator. So you need an orator you need a dual set of orators who I can see actually functioning together, that I don't think they're going to get into a stalemate, that I believe have they've got that tough nut, hardcore motherfucker, but at the same time, like, we're gonna fight for people and lift them up, and I have to believe that they can coalesce and work well together, which is another fear that if I have, I'm sure many other people have, which is like, dude, my wife and I run our company together. Now, when the lawyer set it up, I said, create the ultimate divorce nightmare. I do not want 51%. I want 50%. My wife's gonna have 50%. And yes, that means that we could hit loggerheads and this could all blow up. But because my highest value is my marriage, I want to send a very clear sign to my wife, I don't need authority over you. Because she was like, no, you take the 51%. I was like, I don't need that. I'm going to be able to convince you. You're going to be able to convince me, because I want to listen to you. I want whatever best idea. And in the wedding sense, we are both patriots. We care about this business. We care about this marriage. We're both willing to do what is right. Now, finding that in two people is going to be crazy hard. But if you could find them, and then we had somebody to rally around, somebody that could inspire us, give us chills, right? When they're up there and they're like, because there is a Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech put to music. Dude, it's unbelievable. And if we had somebody that can rally like that, I will make the assumption you've read Long Walk to Freedom.
No.
Oh my God, you're going to love it. Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, fucking blew my mind. And it made me ache for the fact that I read that after he died. And I was just like, I need to know somebody like this. So if we had a leader, look, you've talked about this. I'm literally singing from your hymn book. We need this dual pair of leaders to be inspiring, to give us the chills, and it has to happen right the fuck now, which is why I'm like, I don't see how you pull this off. I get why you're not naming them, but I don't see how you pull it off unless you do.
Well, in some sense, I think you're pointing to the right answer, which is what drives this is patriotism in the best sense of the term, which means that the people you're talking about have to be willing to take the risk. And I don't think it's a huge risk. I think people in general understand that we're in a very tough spot, and therefore anybody who takes a shot at doing something on our behalf is worth honoring, even if it doesn't work. But somebody has to take the reputational risk of saying, actually, you know what? Long shot as this may be, we're in dire straits, and I'm stepping up. So I guess the question is, if I accept your framework, and I think your framework is largely accurate, then maybe it's time. I don't think it's so hard to find people who could inhabit the role. We have a list of people on both left and right who I think make for compelling pairs. The question is anybody ready to step up in a dangerous moment without the guarantee that the groundswell will emerge? In other words, are they willing to precede the groundswell rather than follow it?
Why has it become a meme to say that America is collapsing like the Roman Empire? Growth is petered out. We borrowed from the future. We can't do that anymore. And now we're getting tribal.
Yes, but I don't believe that it is hopeless. If I'm honest, I believe we will probably screw it up, and it will become inevitable.
Lovely.
Yeah. But there's a reason that I'm taking the risks that I am to talk about these things in public, which is I believe we still have the potential to rescue Western civilization, and probably, if I'm honest about it, to present a 2.0 version that is capable of dealing with the novelty that the 1.0 version is straining under. The key thing is human beings detect the failure of growth, because the failure of growth is not an economic fact. It's a fact of resource scarcity, and it has applied to all of our ancestors for 3.5 billion years. So it's not that, growth didn't get invented in a modern economic context. Economics formalized an understanding of something that is as primal as anything else. What must be true in order for us not to descend into this other phase, the phase where musical chairs, the music stops and there are way too few chairs, in which blood is thicker than water, and that's the rule that governs the day. The way to avoid that fate is to A, recognize that it predicts a great deal about the noises people will make as it's happening. So I'm watching the shocking rise in anti-Semitism, and I'm thinking, it's right on time.
Why?
Because when I did my work back in college about Hitler as a rational monster, I understood that the targeting of Jews was a predictable phenomenon. That Jews, because they live as a diaspora, and because they succeed as a diaspora, are an obvious target when the music stops. You can transfer.
Get very concrete about that. Why does being in diaspora, which for people that aren't familiar with that, you're an outside group living in another country. So people often refer to the Chinese as being part of a diaspora because they have a strong sense of the homeland, but yet they may live somewhere else.
Yep. So let's say you've got a population and it's industrious and capable for whatever reason. I would argue that those reasons are largely cultural, maybe entirely so. But it accumulates some wealth, it achieves some position in society, and then the racist impulses return. And one way that you can generate growth for a population is to come up with an excuse to transfer the wealth of another population. So the obvious thing to do is to say, well, the reason that Germany lost World War I was a Jewish fifth column, and the sorry state of Germany today is the result of being stabbed in the back by these people. I mean, maybe they shouldn't even be called people. Maybe they're vermin, they're diseased, they're disgusting, right? You start making those noises and you justify a significant transfer of wealth from one population to another. And this goes back to the question about the founding fathers. Obviously, the time period is different. But if you imagine that Germany, prior to the Holocaust, was a place that involved a few lineages, and then one lineage starts playing against the others, right? Well, you create growth for the one lineage without having to invent a new technology or discover some more efficient way of accomplishing something. It's phony growth. What is it made of? It's made of the stuff that the people you're killing are leaving behind. It's made of their homes, right? You're creating something that feels like growth for one population by targeting another population. And when that happens inside of a landmass, we call it genocide. And when it happens across a border, we call it war. But they're the same process, right? You come up with an excuse to attack some population that can't defend itself, and you create the appearance of growth through theft, right? I mean, if you had a company and it could steal from some other company, it would feel like, oh, well, the value of this company just rose. And the point is, yes, you took stuff from somebody else. So I knew that at the point that the growth ran out, you were going to get rabid anti-Semitism. And frankly, it precedes other forms of virulent racism, but you're going to see those too. And I know where this heads. You're going to come up with excuses for doing away with people who aren't entitled to what they have, and that does end in genocide. So, I think the bad news is this is where we are in history. The good news is we actually have much better tools than we did when this happened previously to understand what's taking place and to change course. But the way you would have to do that is you would have to create a mechanism whereby the population was immunized from the immediate sense of peril that comes when you run out of new ways to generate well-being, right? When growth is not a sustainable process. And the fact that our institutions pretend like all you've got to do, is keep the thing pointed in the right direction and there will always be plenty of growth. That's not true. Growth comes from somewhere, and it does not come from that somewhere regularly. You cannot just create a system that hums along and is always making new stuff. There's boom and there's bust, and you can't afford to have the bust triggering these genocidal impulses, which is what they will do if you don't figure out how to address the question.
Okay, so right now we have two wars going on, one in Ukraine and Russia, one in Israel, Gaza. Are they both the genocidal impulse?
This is tricky. I will say something is going on in Ukraine, and if there's one thing I know, it's that I don't know enough to understand it. Okay? There's the obvious part of it, right? There's Russia having attacked a sovereign nation, and now a generation of young men have been sacrificed to this battle. So I have nothing but compassion for the Ukrainian people in that circumstance. But I also know that there was a question about NATO expansion, and NATO behaved in a way that did not allay Russia's fears. And more to the point, I know that my own government is in the hands of people who had their hands on stuff inside of Ukraine utterly mysteriously before this war broke out. Why is the son of the president involved as some kind of energy expert inside of Ukraine? This is a story about things I don't know, right? So I can't say how genocide maps onto the conflict in Ukraine. I can say it's a complicated puzzle. Israel and Gaza. The unspeakable truth is that you have innocent people trapped on both sides of that conflict and you have a genocidal influence on both sides of that conflict. It's something I don't think I've said that publicly. I've implied it, and I've hoped that people would get it, and I've been told by both sides that I'm a terrible person. But what I said at the beginning of the conflict was that it was threatening to drag the entire world back into lineage against lineage violence. That if we want to save the West and save the world, we have to rescue the Middle East from this predicament, because I don't think either side is being irrational. I think they both understand that they are in a fight to the death, and in a fight to the death, the rules are quite different than you would expect. So there are clearly a majority in Israel who wish to be part of the modern world, would like to get along with their neighbors. I believe that is clear. I cannot say the same thing about the leadership, and I am particularly troubled by the fact that Netanyahu himself, who I must say engaged in absolutely alarming behavior during the pandemic, also appears to have been a facilitator of Hamas in advance of October 7th.
In what way?
What I've seen is video that appears to be Netanyahu advocating for the cynical fueling of Hamas for the purpose of dividing the Palestinians. Now, my feeling is, whatever that was, everybody who participated in any way in making October 7th occur has no business anywhere near any kind of power. This is the last person that should be in charge of a military engagement in Gaza. And I don't know what his motives are. I honestly can't say. All I can say is that he appears to be a madman. And
Netanyahu.
yes.
Do you think that Netanyahu is responsible for October 7th?
If what I have seen that I believe to be credible evidence of his arguing to fund Hamas, if that is accurate, then he is responsible in some way.
In like a conspiratorial, hey guys, here's the money, I know you're going to do it kind of way?
If we believe in the consent of the governed, and somebody else from outside the governed acts to choose your leaders, and those leaders behave badly, and you suffer mightily because of the bad behavior of leaders that somebody else chose for you, you're responsible. Do I know what he was really thinking? How would I know? I couldn't possibly be more of an outsider to this.
Is this a hypothesis or a thesis?
No, it's an extrapolation. I don't know how it could be any clearer. Palestinians are people. I believe that the right that allows me, as a governed person, consent over that process of governance extends to all people, or it should.
Do you think it matters where we define a people? Is that a relevant part of this, or it just...
It's a practical question, but this is going to drag us.
Because I don't know if you're saying that based on the UN Charter, which talks about a people and there are certain protections afforded to them, or if you just mean, look, any group of people, whether it's somebody in a city or whatever.
Look, if you're going to be governed, you have a right to consent in the consent of the governed sense of that term. I believe people have a right to self-determination. I am not an expert on Palestinians or the Palestinian mindset. I do not know what the people of Gaza would have done without Netanyahu's meddling. Maybe it would have been the same thing. I don't know what Israel is supposed to do in light of this absolutely barbaric attack. But I do know that whatever engaged in that attack put Israel in a bind. There was no way for Israel not to respond to that attack. The brutality was calculated to make it impossible for Israel to choose. It was calculated to bring about a response that would be overwhelming because somebody thought that was a good idea. Presumably Hamas thought that would be a good idea. Now, Hamas should be wiped from the earth. There's no question about that. These are terrible people. Whatever they were thinking, these are terrible people. And eliminating them would make the world a better place. That's obviously not the same thing as the Palestinian people. And given the way Hamas embeds itself, what Israel's supposed to do is not obvious. But if there's one thing that is obvious, Netanyahu shouldn't be in charge of it.
Okay. So that was born of the question as to whether or not there is a genocidal impulse that we can actually put to bed through conversation by getting people to understand what it is, pulling it into the public consciousness, and by doing so, eradicate this kind of thing.
Well, let me add one thing just so it's
please.
clear. We are all the product of genocides.
That does not track for me.
Human history is long.
Yep.
People killing their competitors is common in history. Most of it has been lost. It wasn't recorded.
You're just saying we're the ones that won.
Yeah, we're here, and we are also, it is fair to say, all the product of multiple rapes. Human history is very long.
Give me a percentage. What percentage of people do you have are downstream of a rape?
Oh, I think all of us.
Literally 100%.
Yeah, I think as soon as you realize how long a period of ancestry we're talking about, the chances that there's not a rape somewhere in each of our backgrounds is approaching zero.
That's dark.
It's dark, but it's also, it's dark. Look at it. But once you have looked at it, realize what that means. The potential for rape and genocide is something we all carry. We are also capable of getting past it. There is so much hope in that recognition. Once you realize that you are not condemned to live this reality just because it had a significance in ancestral times, that's where liberation comes from. We don't have to live that way. We can actually sit and write down our values, and we can say, what is the system that actually makes us realize those values at the highest level, right? What would we like to happen with rape? Well, we would like it to go to zero. Likewise, genocide. That's what it means when we say never again. So when I say that there's a genocidal impulse on both sides, we are seeing the predictable outcome of a zero-sum game in the Middle East that is triggering potentials that we all carry, right? We can see exactly why we have to take these potentials seriously in this conflagration. And the right thing to do is actually not beat each other over the head, each side accusing the other side of genocide. The correct thing to do is to recognize this was predictable, and we have the power, if we'll stop dicking around with nonsense, we have the power to make the future better than the past.
Man, I'm with you. And look, this has just become an interview where throwing out a platitude of "I hope everything's going to be okay" just does not feel right. So I will ask the more revealing question. It is not agreed upon as to whether what's happening right now is genocide. And this is, there are several things you feel like nobody's listening to you. You're screaming from the rooftops and people just aren't getting it. I have a very similar sense when I talk to people about somebody's frame of reference, the whole life beer goggles. That will control how they interpret what people are calling facts. And people oft quote Ben Shapiro and say, facts don't care about your feelings. Bro, we cannot agree on what the facts are, or certainly we can't agree on what the facts mean. And I actually don't think people are playing a game. I think people don't understand how distorted all of our worldviews are, that we actually see only the distortions. And to us, you're going to get people that look at this and go, obviously what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. Obviously. And you're going to get people that obviously that's not genocide. This is crazy. I can't even believe we're having this conversation. And each side thinks the other's trying to play a linguistic game or something like that. And they're missing what I think is the real truth, which is they see the world so ferociously in one way. There is literally nothing that you could show them, and I mean nothing, that would make them go, oh, I see your point. And because there is literally nothing that you could show them, like, let's set the Jews aside for a second, because this just gets so weird so fast, especially right now. In Rwanda, like almost 1 million people were hacked to death with machetes in like 6 weeks. So that's insane. And it keeps happening. Now, I've not researched the Rwandan genocide, so for all I know, they were both like, yeah, this is genocide, and it's completely justified, which then just enters another problem, which is, yeah, it's genocide. What's the problem? People really become convinced I am doing God's bidding. I am doing the just and right thing in what I'm doing. And the only way that I see getting to the other side of that is everybody has to wake up to one simple fact. Ideas control everything. And what I mean by that are you believe certain things to be true. You confuse it for objective reality, which is physics, but you believe certain things are true. Call it is. Then you have a set of things, your values, that you believe ought to be true. And so now you have is, which they confuse for objective reality, and ought, which they often confuse with just self-evident or divine, whatever. And like, this is non-negotiable. And both of those things will be ferociously debated by the other side, who sees the truth of neither. They have their own is and their own ought. And so until we all go, I know I'm in the grips of a delusion. I cannot see things clearly. And so we all have to come to some set of shared values, and then you build up from that. If we can't share values, no matter how much you talk about genocide, you will death loop because people will just sidestep it by saying, but this isn't genocide, or genocide is right. Yeah, it is genocide, but hey, it's what we have to do.
That was a very good summation. It overlaps many things that I also believe. I think distinguishing between beliefs and values is crucial. What you're saying with respect to we are all suffering a delusion, I agree is correct. I call this the Cartesian crisis, and I think we are knee-deep in it, and it is, if you understand its implications, it's terrifying. The Cartesian crisis, I named it that after Descartes, who became spooked when he realized that all of the things that he thought were facts, what you say, you think it's physics, but it's beliefs, he had not established himself, and therefore was taking it on some kind of authority. The problem is that the systematically induced blindness that is being inflicted on the public is creating a scenario in which we really can't establish much of anything. And that does leave us vulnerable to being sold a narrative, right? It just fills the vacuum of what you might actually believe in common. The obvious right thing for us to want is an agreement on basics, that enlightenment is better than deciding what you're allowed to believe, for example. Let's pursue enlightenment. Let us agree to share facts. We can differ over values. We should talk about which values should govern how we are to live. But we should not be differing over the basic facts. And we should be, and this is crucial, using the one tool that actually allows us to establish those facts in a way that is utterly nonpartisan. Science works because it is built to tell you what you do not believe. It corrects for biases. If it were not for this one value, it wouldn't be worth doing. It's too cumbersome and slow. But because it is the only system that allows you to see exactly the thing that you do not expect, it has the capability of telling us what is true, and to know that it is true on the basis that it predicts things better than some other idea. So that's the tool. It belongs to no one, or it belongs to us all equally. And those who politicize it are putting us all in jeopardy. This is why I'm trying to bring this tool to people in this way and show them that it applies to the things that they're battling over, and that the only way out is through. We have to learn to wield this tool to figure out where we even are in an era where all of the institutions that should be doing that job are failing at once. We're going to have to build institutions that work. Some people think we can rescue the institutions we have. I'm less and less convinced of that. But I know that we can build something that does the job, and we have to stop bludgeoning each other over the product of scientific inquiry. You know, the facts are what they are, and then the values tell you what to think about them. And if you divide things in that way so that we're not battling over the facts based on the idea that they are somehow themselves immoral, then there's hope.
Can I try an idea out on you?
Please.
All right. I think that the way the human animal is designed, that there is no way for us to come to a consensus. The only way to get us to operate in mutually beneficial ways is to tap into other base shit, which I will just round to greed, but I don't mean in a bad way. I think the only way out for something like Israel-Hamas is to get people obsessed with the future of their children. If you believe that the brightest future for your kids could be getting killed, being martyred, going to heaven, then that idea traps you. Now violence is rad. Like, that's a great way to ensure that your child has a wonderful future. If, on the other hand, you believe my child's future can be full of education and, I guess I'll say, terrestrial love here on this planet for at least this period of time, and tomorrow's going to be better than today, and that they're going to make progress and it's going to be wonderful, and they're going to grow up and they're going to fall in love and they're going to have kids, and this is going to go on forever. That feels like, when I look backwards to identify how to move forwards, I go, yes, you want progress, health and safety, love for one's kin, to see them grow up, et cetera, et cetera.
I think you're right. On the question of Islam, I will just simply point out that there are numerous examples in the Middle East in which Islamic states attempted to modernize, were embracing values that were not exactly Western, but were moving in that direction. And I believe that, unfortunately, for reasons that in the end were profoundly economic, we have disrupted this process. We in the West have disrupted this process, and it has created a conflagration that did not need to happen.
How did we disrupt it?
Well, the Shah of Iran was installed to basically facilitate transfer of economic resources. We overrode a democratic impulse in Iran, and it has resulted in a theocratic rebellion. So what would have happened if we had not meddled in Iran? Would Iran today be where it is, or is that entirely the result of resentment against the West that has left a vacuum that has been filled by to connect it to an earlier part of the conversation, you have these two bases for cooperation. You have reciprocity, which I would argue is the way the modern world should be structured, and there's lineage against lineage violence. And I believe that our meddling in the Middle East has set the course to lineage against lineage violence, which we now largely wrongly blame on the content of the religious doctrine. right? The religious doctrine does contain this violence, but the question is, exactly as is the case with Israel, right? The Old Testament contains some really toxic stuff, but most Israelis want to be part of the modern world, right? The fact that there's this bad stuff in the founding documents is not fate. So I'm not sure what to do with that, and I've gotten detained trying to explain this connection. But the right thing to do is to recognize that we are all better off. All of humanity is better off if we do embrace, you're calling it greed, I wouldn't use that term, but if we recognize that humanity is improved when human beings are enabled to compete in a way that ecologically we would call exploitation competition. There's two kinds of competition. You've got exploitation competition and interference competition, right? If I bomb your factory so you can't make stuff, I am arguably competing with you, but it's a destructive kind of competition. If I try to make better stuff than you in order to outcompete you in the market, and you try to make better stuff than me because you want to succeed, then the point is what we get is an improvement in the quality of the things we have access to. So what you really want at the end of the day, and I'm not telling you I know how to instantiate this, but what you really want at the end of the day is for people to profit when they bring things to the table that improve the quality, the length of human life. The way to do that, to the extent that there's something we can describe, is to internalize all of the costs of our activities and let the market solve the problem. If you let the market solve the problem, and if somehow, and I'm not claiming I know how to do it, because it may just simply not be possible, but if you did internalize all of the costs of every product and every process, so that at the end of the day, the only people who profited were people who made things that actually made us better off, you don't need to do anything else. That solves the entire problem right there. Then you get people spending their time trying to figure out how to improve the standing of humanity, and when they succeed, the quality of their personal life gets enhanced. That's what you want. That allows the market to do what it's good at without interfering with our values, and it minimally facilitates, or it prevents the outbreak of tyrannical impulses. The market simply tells us what things should be augmented and which things should be abandoned based on whether or not their impact on humanity was positive.
Yeah. Why has it become a meme to say that America is collapsing like the Roman Empire? What are people trying to deal with when they say that?
I think there is a palpable sensation that the system is coming apart. So I think it's not incorrect to think of collapse occurring. I think of it as a slow motion collapse. I don't think of the Roman Empire very frequently, other than just the simple fact that something that seemed as robust as it must have can also come apart. I also remember from childhood the surprise collapse of the Soviet Union. But once you recognize that things that seem like they are forever still end, it's not hard to recognize the signs in where we are now. I guess I'm glad we're finally having that discussion, because the risk that the Republic was going to come apart was there and has been for decades. And if we are going to get through this phase, either by rescuing the Republic or figuring out how to walk away from a crash landing, it's going to be because we understand what the implications are.
I've heard you say that the rational optimist position isn't wrong. We can get there, but we're not going to get there by accident. So what is it that is being chipped away at now that's stopping us from naturally ending up on the optimistic path?
I think we have antagonists to our ability to understand where we are. And in fact, I've grown tired of the idea of sense making. You know, that concept became hackneyed, but there is some need to grapple with the evidence around you and to put it together into some kind of model. And we have some force that is opposed to our ability to do that well. It is denying us basic information on readily answerable questions that would allow us to navigate the most basic issues of life well. And so we keep injuring ourselves because something is acting to keep us in the dark.
What are some of the things that it's stopping us from seeing?
Well, let's take an obvious question from the COVID crisis. We were told that the mRNA shots were safe and effective. They've now been given to literally billions of people. We have highly credible claims of certain patterns of pathology that have arisen downstream, and we have a mind-numbing set of denials over the connection between, for example, tumors, various kinds of cardiac issues, and anybody who has gone through the process of studying science knows that these are not difficult questions. There are difficult questions, but the simple, are people who took these shots more prone to X, Y, or Z condition than people who didn't take them? That is not a hard thing to ascertain. And yet we are just simply going to battle over it till the end of time because it has somehow become important that we not be able to reach a scientifically robust conclusion about it.
To learn more about these complex topics, check out this episode with the one and only Jordan Peterson.
Look how much I love my son. He doesn't even have a penis anymore. Those women online displaying themselves, they're not human. You're a fool if you think that's human. And Jews, you know, they have IQs that are probably 15 points higher than the typical. So they're radically...